Hi, I'm Angel. Thanks for stopping by. I am trying a new thing, as I often do, and I already set up part one with an explanation of what I'm about to do. So if you're curious and or feeling a little lost, look for part one. This is part two of an experimental project of mine, which I'm going to call the Little Chicken Story. This is a very, very rough draft of a story that's unfinished, that's coming through me. It's an up-leveled version of an old story that humans have been telling in various versions, the Chicken Little story, which you're probably familiar with. Maybe the most current version, the Disney version. I was familiar with an 1800s version with a falling leaf. The sky is falling is the overarching theme, and also a theme of poultry, a theme of expansion of awareness. And here is the rough draft of the beginning of my up-leveled version. It starts with a little intro. Henry, the little chicken. He was hatched small-ish and concluded himself dependent and destined to be eaten. So he was. Chapter 1. Part 1, I think it is, really. Part 1. Henrietta, the little chicken, was expected to be small, and no one cared that her wings were a little deformed and her feet didn't work quite right, as long as she could squirt out an unfertilized egg, which her body did all on its own. Then the dog god keepers kept her. One day she had a thought. She hadn't really had a thought before, not that she was aware of before this. Her very first thought. She'd had feelings, sensations. Most of them were vaguely unpleasant. Squeezing out eggs had some vaguely pleasant sensations to it, and that feelings in her malformed and mostly numb legs and her feet and wings. The thought she had, her very first thought that she could remember having was, drum roll, I wonder who decided this is how my life would be. Some time later, when she had developed her capacity for more complex thinking, contemplations, she would reflect on that thought and think she must have had become aware of some contrast, some other way things could be, to have had that thought occur in her. I wonder who decided that this is how my life would be. This was her thought. She pondered this thought for some days, becoming more and more acutely aware of how cramped her body was most of the time, in contrast to the time she was shooed outside suddenly, or even just shoved or scooted into the sunshine, a violently bright and warm, fiery thing. And then she would begin to notice how other birds were. Some of them had wings that flapped heartily, and she had no wings at all, or some had no wings at all. And some were somewhere in between those two extremes, like hers. Some of the others ran around quite quickly, pecking around at all sorts of things. And some sat quietly or looking fretfully, clucking or ruffling their feathers, fending off those pecking ones who would come to them if they could. Henrietta started to realize that there seemed to be a wide variety of potential chicken lives in the barn and in the yard, and she began to notice differences. Maybe the long-legged ones decided they seemed to be exactly or mostly the same to her. Maybe it was the barn, the yard that decided the buildings, or the fence. Maybe it was the sun. It seemed very powerful. Henrietta contemplated these choices for some time. And one day, during the bright time in the yard, she decided to try to run after one of the more active, larger chickens. She didn't really think it through beforehand. She just had the idea and decided to go with it. And she was a bit surprised at first as she got her legs going, and for 10 or 20 steps she found herself running. Henrietta had never run before. She had barely hobbled a few steps at a time. Her legs couldn't keep up with her intention, and she crashed face or beak first into the dirt. It took her a few minutes to get back upright, and she found some relief in settling back into the dirt, feeling the sun in her feathers. Henrietta had fallen on her face or beak before, countless, uncounted numbers of times, but this time something was different. She contemplated what it was. Some new feeling was in her that she didn't recognize. It wasn't a feeling in any specific part that she could identify. Somewhere, like in the middle or the center of her chest, maybe. What was this now, she wondered. She found herself thinking about this new sensation off and on the next dark phase, and started to get a bit excited when she realized she could decide to try the same thing next time she was in the light and see if she could get that feeling again. And as soon as she made that choice, she started to get the feeling, what is this now? She realized it couldn't be from the running or falling, because this time she was still confined, unable to move at all, in fact, except for ever so slightly. And she remained agitated and uncertain if it was pleasant or unpleasant for some time. And finally, the next light period arrived, and Henrietta was swept outside with a broom rather unpleasantly, but she didn't really mind this time. She had a growing feeling that she did not recognize. You or might have called it excitement or anticipation, but the little chicken felt agitated and uncertain. She paused and soaked in some warm, soothing energy from the sunshine. And then she gathered her strength and focused her attention on a rather aggressively agitated hen that was in line to run by. And when she did, she flung herself forward with all her might and landed straight in the dirt again. She got herself upright a bit quicker this time and spent the rest of that light period contemplating her feelings. Her face felt a little unpleasant. And this was the most thinking she had ever done. And the little chicken had a series of epiphanies during the following next light segment of time. She realized for the first time that there was a brief time when the overhead barn lights were off, but there was still some light, and that it was a soft light, much softer than the giant ball of burning fire in the yard, and a different color from the light she was most often under. The little chicken exhausted herself and squeezed out her egg and fell asleep. And the next time she found herself awake, Henrietta marveled a bit at her own increasingly complex awareness. She revisited her original question again. I wonder who or what decides or decided how my life is or how I am. And she thought about her new sensations, and she suddenly realized she had decided to do something and done it. And that was what had led to the new feelings, which, although disturbing and unsettling, had also felt amazing. That's the end of part 1. I've got part 2 about finished, and I'm going to pause this video and come back to part 2. Thanks for tuning in for my experimental very first, that was the very first out loud reading to even myself of my very own version, although I feel like the universe is just allowing me to translate this up-leveled version for us all of the old Chicken Little story. My version is called the Little Chicken. That was part 1. Check out, there's an intro, and you can find part 2 coming up next. Don't forget to check out the description for ways you can support me and my channel if you care to, and give me a thumbs up, subscribe, all that stuff. Thanks. Ciao for now.